ZHENJIANG has a recorded history of 3,000 years. You go back to the decentralized Zhou dynasty period. This was a feudal center. We're talking, 700s BC. Fast forward to the rise of the Qin dynasty several centuries later. This is China's first great empire. Qin dynasty, a trend-setting dynasty, an empire able to unite both North and South China. And pretty much all Chinese dynasties and states, including, arguably, the current one, will seek to imitate certain precedents laid down by the Qin. ZHENJIANG would have been found in the Qin state's southern domains. Well, the Qin state doesn't last long. It's followed by 400 years of mostly uninterrupted Han dynasty rule, after which the Han dynasty crumbles and China enters what's known as the Three Kingdoms period, much romanticized Three Kingdoms period since Ming times, much romanticized. But one of those kingdoms, the Kingdom of Wu, ZHENJIANG would have been situated within it. And it's during this period, not coincidentally, that the town is fortified with walls, but also King Fuqiao ordered the building of a canal, both for the movement of food and of troops. The building of a canal. Small canal at the time, but a canal that was destined to be the genesis of what would be the largest or longest canal, and to this day the oldest working canal in the world, China's Grand Canal. And we'll get back to the Grand Canal in just a second. That all started right here. Well, anyway, Three Kingdoms period ends. You have the brief rise of the Jin, but then the crumbling of that empire as well. So for centuries leading up to that and after, China is actually an amalgam of states, so politically very broken up. It wasn't until the late 500s that another great Chinese dynasty would establish itself in the south, that of the Sui, who recognized ZHENJIANG's strategic position near the entrance to the Yangtze. They captured ZHENJIANG and quickly stocked it with soldiers as a garrison town. But the Sui, who needed a reliable source of food, both for the royal court and their nomad fighting army, they also built the first incarnation of the Grand Canal, finally connecting North China with South China by man-made waterway. Emperor Yang conscripted all men between the ages of 15 and 50 to work on his massive project. And if someone tried to run away and was caught, they were to be executed. Their family was to be executed, down to the third generation. Any official who spoke out against the project was to be beheaded. So in this way, somewhere between 1 million and 3.5 million people, laborers, men and women, were conscripted and put to work, connecting all the pre-existing canals into one Grand Canal, linking the Yellow River in the north with Hangzhou in the south. So quite a project. Anything in its way, houses, even tombs, were demolished to make way for the project. Untold numbers of laborers died during its construction. Untold numbers more died of starvation because most of the conscripted folk were farmers and they were not producing food on their farms. They were, slogging away at the canal. The Tang dynasty picked up where the Sui had left off, using ZHENJIANG as a military and especially tax collection hub. See, the Grand Canal made it perfect as a hub for collecting grain, collecting or taxing grain by violence or the threat of violence, and then shipping it up the canal to the capital. That role for ZHENJIANG as military hub, but also as tax collection hub, thanks to its position along the Yangtze and the Grand Canal, was continued after the Tang fell. During the Song period. In fact, during the Song, navigation and communication along the Grand Canal got even easier with the invention of the pound lock, which made it possible to go into higher elevation areas by canal. Both the Yuan and the Ming repaired the Grand Canal, added to the Grand Canal. Of course, their capital was way up north in Beijing, so the Grand Canal was extended to connect all the way up there. The building of the Grand Canal is important, not only because it caused the deaths of millions of people, not only because it was expensive, so expensive that, for example, it may have helped bring down the Sui dynasty completely. Not only because it changed the economic landscape of China, not only because it joined a perhaps more naturally bifurcated North and South China. The Chinese heartland is, after all, a land of east-west rivers, but also because it provided the more war-torn North, or the peoples of the more war-torn North, a conduit to a much more peaceful and much more prosperous south. And it provided a conduit for all that southern wealth to, sort of get transported up north. And this is important because in the centuries after its construction, the demographic face of China will be completely changed by a steady stream of Han and non-Han migrants from the north and refugees from the north, particularly during times of war, obviously, south. Even when the political and military capital was in the north, and it often was, people kept coming south because the south was the economic center. The south was the breadbasket, and that drew people. During the First Opium War, 15,000 British troops showed up here in ZHENJIANG. In fact, it was the last major battle in that war. The British fought the defenders held the British off for a while, but ultimately the British did take the city, and what did they do? Well, they blockaded the Grand Canal. So all that grain and all those supplies and all that tax revenue no longer flowing up to Beijing. And within weeks, the Qing had surrendered. A few years later, ZHENJIANG was the site of much loss of life and devastation connected to the catastrophic Taiping Rebellion, which was then sweeping much of China. And all the while, this is mid-19th century we're talking about here, sea traffic had increased, coastal traffic had increased, so the Grand Canal sort of fell into disuse, particularly the northern half of the Grand Canal, almost complete disuse, which economically, obviously, seriously impacted ZHENJIANG and the region. And even with the opening of the region to foreign trade, including lots and lots of opium, ZHENJIANG never really recovered from the loss of all that Grand Canal traffic. After the fall of the Qing, and eventually the establishment of the Republic of China, ZHENJIANG was made the provincial capital of Jiangsu province. Another Jiangsu city, Nanjing, was made the capital of the Republic of China. Then a few years later, the Japanese invaded, and ZHENJIANG was the site of fierce fighting, fierce resistance to the Japanese, actually, though the Japanese did ultimately take the city as a precursor to their very brutal takedown of Nanjing just down the road. Is, by the way, great illustration. I'm sure it's obvious now that ZHENJIANG both benefited greatly and suffered greatly due to its geographical position on the road to Nanjing on the Grand Canal, right there on the Yangtze. Depending on the time period, greatly benefited or greatly suffered. In this case, greatly suffered. Rape of Nanking, one of the atrocities of World War II, just down the road from ZHENJIANG and just after the taking of ZHENJIANG. Well, after World War II and after the Chinese Civil War, Mao's communist regime took over, and ZHENJIANG was stripped of its provincial capital status. Nanjing became the capital of Jiangsu, while the communists set up shop in Beijing. Now, despite the decline of much of the Grand Canal, and despite all the death and destruction meted out in ZHENJIANG and the area around ZHENJIANG during the 19th and 20th centuries, ZHENJIANG today is a vibrant city. The city proper is home to over 500,000 people, and it remains connected to much of real China by waterways, both natural and man-made. It's also connected, of course, today by rail and by air and by road to all of China's great cities. See, while the Great Wall of China is well known throughout the world, the Great Wall is today a historical relic. It's a tourist attraction. But the Grand Canal of China, the Grand Canal is still active. It's still in use. In fact, if you were to add up all the freight that moves along U.S. waterways, put it all together, it's about the same as the amount of freight that moves along the Grand Canal. So pretty incredible. The Grand Canal is a potent symbol of the supposed unity between North China and South China. This is a unity that was first practically applied by force by the Qin 2,000 years ago, and a unity that, or at least a symbol, that the current regime would very much like to keep intact. Considering ZHENJIANG's place along the Grand Canal, and considering the canal's place in Chinese history, perhaps it's safe to say that ZHENJIANG and the Grand Canal are not quite done making history.